The autumn morning started like any other at the Cherry Grove Police Department. The small Midwestern town, with its population of just under 30,000, rarely saw federal agents walking through its doors. But today was different. Special Agent Taylor Chen pulled into the station's parking lot in her standard-issue black SUV, adjusting her navy blazer as she stepped out. Her badge glinted in the early morning sun, its weight familiar after 15 years with the Bureau. She'd spent the last decade becoming one of the FBI's top forensic accountants, with a wall of commendations back in her D.C. office to prove it. The case seemed straightforward enough. A string of suspicious transactions flowing through local businesses that pointed to possible money laundering. But experience had taught her that in small towns, navigating local law enforcement relationships could be trickier than following the money. As she walked toward the building's entrance, Chen noticed a patrol car pulling in. Officer Robert Hayes stepped out, his face hardening as he spotted her. She'd dealt with looks like that before. The mixture of suspicion and dismissal that some small-town officers couldn't hide when faced with a federal agent who didn't fit their expectations. "Can I help you?" Hayes called out, his tone making it clear he wasn't offering assistance. Chen held up her credentials, her voice steady and professional. "Special Agent Chen, FBI. I'm here to meet with Chief Thompson about the First Street financial investigation." Hayes stepped closer, squinting at her badge with exaggerated scrutiny. "Gonna need to see some additional ID. Can't be too careful these days." His emphasis on careful carried an unmistakable edge. Chen maintained her composure, though her jaw tightened slightly. She prepared for this, just as she had countless times before. From her briefcase, she produced her driver's license and her official FBI identification card. "3 forms of ID enough for you, Officer Hayes?" she asked, noting his name tag. Her tone remained perfectly professional, though a hint of steel ran beneath it. Hayes made a show of examining each document, holding them up to the light. Around them, other officers began arriving for the morning shift, some slowing down to watch the interaction. Chen could feel their eyes on her, but she stood her ground, back straight, expression neutral. "These look real enough," Hayes finally admitted, unable to find any fault with her credentials. "But I'll need to escort you inside. Protocol, you understand." Chen knew very well there was no such protocol for a federal agent who had already been cleared to visit, but she nodded. "Of course. Lead the way." As they walked through the station, Hayes made sure to stop at every checkpoint, questioning Chen's presence and making her show her credentials repeatedly. Each time, she complied without complaint, though she carefully noted every officer's name and reaction. At the front desk, the sergeant on duty looked embarrassed as Hayes insisted on yet another credential check. "Officer Hayes," the sergeant began, "I have Agent Chen's visit logged in the system." "Just doing my job thoroughly," Hayes cut in. "Wouldn't want any unauthorized persons accessing sensitive areas." Chen watched the sergeant's discomfort grow, noting how he glanced apologetically in her direction. This, too, was familiar. The silent witnesses who recognized the wrongness but hesitated to speak up. Finally reaching the chief's office, Hayes rapped sharply on the door. "Chief, got someone here claiming to be FBI. Wanted to make sure you were expecting her." Chief Thompson looked up from his desk, his expression shifting from confusion to recognition to embarrassment in quick succession. "Agent Chen, yes, we spoke yesterday. Please come in." He shot Hayes a sharp look. "Officer, don't you have patrol duty?" As Hayes reluctantly departed, Chen settled into the chair across from the chief's desk. She placed her briefcase carefully beside her, withdrew her case files, and began laying out the evidence she'd gathered. Her voice remained steady as she launched into her presentation, not acknowledging the morning's events. But as she walked the chief through the complex web of suspicious transactions, her mind was already working on a different problem. She'd encountered officers like Hayes throughout her career, and experience had taught her that direct confrontation rarely led to lasting change. No, she would need a more strategic approach. When the chief asked who she'd like to work with as a local liaison, Chen didn't hesitate. "Officer Hayes seems very thorough," she said, watching surprise flash across Thompson's face. "I appreciate attention to detail in financial investigations." As she left the chief's office 30 minutes later, Chen allowed herself a small smile. The real work was just beginning, and not all of it would involve bank statements and transaction records. Sometimes, the most important changes started with the most unlikely partnerships. The morning sun had risen fully now, casting long shadows across the station's parking lot as Chen walked back to her vehicle. She had a long day ahead, reviewing records at First Street Financial, interviewing potential witnesses, and now finding a way to turn an adversary into an ally. But then again, she hadn't become one of the Bureau's best by taking the easy path. The Cherry Grove Police Department's conference room buzzed with morning activity. Officers gathered for the joint briefing on the financial crimes investigation, coffee cups in hand, their murmured conversations filling the air. Agent Chen stood near the front, arranging her presentation materials while carefully observing the room's dynamics. Officer Hayes arrived last, deliberately taking the seat farthest from where Chen stood. She noticed how he whispered to the officers around him, causing several to glance in her direction with poorly concealed smirks. The behavior was familiar. She'd seen it in stations across the country. But she kept her focus on setting up her laptop, her movements calm and deliberate. "All right, everyone," Chief Thompson called out, bringing the room to order. "As you know, we've got a major financial investigation on our hands. Special Agent Chen from the FBI is here to brief us on the situation." Chen stepped forward, but before she could speak, Hayes's voice cut through the room. "Chief, shouldn't we verify her credentials again? Maybe have someone from the Bureau office in Cincinnati confirm her assignment?" His tone dripped with false concern. The room grew uncomfortably quiet. Chen could feel the weight of every officer's gaze, some embarrassed, others curious, a few openly hostile. She prepared for this moment, knowing it would set the tone for the entire investigation. "Thank you for your diligence, Officer Hayes," she responded, her voice steady and professional. "I've already provided 3 forms of identification, and Chief Thompson has confirmed my assignment with the Bureau. Now, shall we focus on the $2 million that's been laundered through businesses in your jurisdiction?" She clicked to her first slide, displaying a complex web of transactions. "This money isn't just disappearing into thin accounts. It's funding drug operations in your neighborhoods, in the places where your children play." The room's attention shifted. Even Hayes sat up straighter as Chen walked them through the investigation's findings. She highlighted local businesses involved, places the officers knew well: the coffee shop where they grabbed their morning brew, the hardware store where they bought their supplies. "Officer Rodriguez," she called out to a young officer in the front row, "you mentioned earlier that you patrol the area near First Street Financial. Have you noticed increased activity there during off hours?" Rodriguez nodded eagerly. "Yes, ma'am. Lot of people coming and going late at night, especially on Thursdays." "Exactly what our surveillance suggests," Chen confirmed, giving him an appreciative nod. She continued involving different officers, drawing on their local knowledge, making them part of the investigation. Hayes couldn't stay quiet for long. "This all seems pretty basic," he interrupted. "Shouldn't the FBI have more solid evidence before wasting our time?" Chen met his gaze steadily. "Officer Hayes, you've been on the force for what, 15 years? She didn't wait for his response. "Then you know as well as I do that the best investigations are built on solid groundwork. Your experience would be particularly valuable in understanding local connections we might have missed." Several officers turned to look at Hayes, waiting for his reaction. He shifted in his seat, caught between his desire to undermine her and the professional acknowledgement she'd just offered. "Now," Chen continued, pulling up surveillance photos, "we've identified several key players, but we need your insights on their local connections." She laid out the evidence methodically, building a case that even the most skeptical officers couldn't dismiss. As the briefing progressed, she noticed subtle shifts in the room's dynamics. Officers who had initially avoided eye contact began asking questions. Even those who had smirked at Hayes' earlier comments were now fully engaged in the discussion. But Hayes wasn't done. During the question period, he stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This all looks like small-time stuff to me. Why is the FBI really here? Don't you have bigger cases in D.C., Agent Chen? Or is this some kind of diversity initiative?" The room fell silent. Several officers looked down at their notepads, others shifted uncomfortably. Chief Thompson started to stand, his face reddening, but Chen raised her hand slightly, signaling she would handle it. $2 million might seem small time to you, Officer Hayes, she replied, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. But I've spent 15 years following money trails just like this one. They've led to drug rings, human trafficking operations, and terrorist funding. Every major case I've cracked started with someone paying attention to the details that others dismissed as small time. She clicked to her final slide, showing photos of families, ordinary people from communities just like Cherry Grove. These are the victims from my last 3 cases, regular people who lost their life savings because nobody looked closely enough at the small-time stuff. She paused, letting the images sink in. Now, who wants to help me make sure that doesn't happen here? Hands went up around the room, including some from officers who had been skeptical at the start. Hayes remained standing, his face a mix of emotions he couldn't quite control. Chen held his gaze for a moment before turning to address a question from another officer. As the briefing wrapped up, Chen overheard fragments of conversation as officers filed out. "She really knows her stuff," one whispered. "Did you see those transaction patterns?" Another added. "Hayes was way out of line," a third muttered. Chen packed up her materials slowly, watching Hayes linger by the door. She knew this moment would define their future interactions. When he finally approached her, his steps reluctant, she looked up expectantly. "The surveillance photos," he said stiffly. "I might have some additional information about the Thursday night activities at First Street Financial." Chen nodded, keeping her expression neutral. "I'd appreciate your insights, Officer Hayes. Would you like to discuss them over coffee?" It wasn't an olive branch exactly, more like a professional rope bridge across a deep ravine. But as Hayes nodded curtly, Chen knew it was a start. Sometimes, the biggest changes began with the smallest steps. The local diner buzzed with the usual lunch crowd noise as Agent Chen sat across from Officer Hayes in a corner booth. Steam rose from their coffee cups, creating a thin barrier between them. The warm leather seats squeaked as Hayes shifted uncomfortably, clearly wondering why the agent he tried to humiliate had requested him as her liaison. "The surveillance photos you mentioned," Chen began, pulling out a folder. "What caught your attention about them?" Hayes glanced at the photos, then back at Chen, his expression guarded. "Thursday nights, there's a weekly poker game at Pete's Bar 2 blocks from First Street Financial. Some of these people," he tapped the photos, "they're regulars there." Chen nodded, making notes. "Tell me more about Pete's Bar." "Been there 20 years. Owner's got a reputation for running a clean place." Hayes paused, then added reluctantly, "But lately there's been different crowd coming in. Lot of out-of-town plates in the parking lot." As they talked, the waitress brought their food, a cheeseburger for Hayes, a club sandwich for Chen. The familiar smell of diner food seemed to ease some of the tension. "You've been on this beat for 15 years, Chen said, taking a bite of her sandwich. "That's valuable experience. You probably notice things others miss." Hayes studied her face, looking for signs of mockery, but found none. "Look," he said finally, putting down his burger, "why did you request me as your liaison?" "After this morning, well, we both know what happened." Chen wiped her mouth with a napkin, taking her time to respond. "Because you're thorough. Maybe for the wrong reasons this morning, but thorough nonetheless. This case needs that kind of attention to detail." "That's it?" Hayes asked, disbelief evident in his voice. "That, and I've learned something in 15 years with the Bureau." Chen leaned forward slightly. "The officers who give me the hardest time often end up being the best allies once they see I'm good at my job. I'm willing to prove myself, Officer Hayes. The question is, are you willing to watch and learn?" The diner's bell chimed as new customers entered, momentarily drawing their attention. When Hayes looked back at Chen, something had shifted in his expression. "There's something else about Pete's Bar," he said slowly. "The poker games, they started right around the time those suspicious transactions began showing up." Chen pulled out her notebook, and for the next hour, they dove deep into the local knowledge that didn't show up in any official reports. Hayes knew every business owner's habits, every regular's routine, every deviation from the normal patterns of small-town life. As they worked, Chen noticed Hayes's demeanor gradually changing. His responses became more detailed, his insights more freely offered. When she asked about a particular business owner's schedule, he pulled out his own notebook, filled with meticulous observations from his patrols. "This is good work," Chen said, genuinely impressed by his level of detail. "Why didn't you mention any of this during the briefing?" Hayes stared into his now empty coffee cup. Honestly, I didn't think the FBI would care about small-town observations. Figured you had your big city methods. The best investigations combine both, Chen replied. Your street-level knowledge with our broader resources. That's why I'm here, not working this case from a desk in D.C. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the diner's windows as they continued working. Other officers who came in for coffee did double takes at the sight of Hayes and Chen working together, heads bent over documents, engaged in intense discussion. We should check the camera feeds from the convenience store across from Pete's, Hayes suggested, pointing to a location on the map they'd spread out. Owner owes me a favor. He might let us look without a warrant. Chen smiled slightly. Now you're thinking like an investigator, but let's do this by the book. I'll have a warrant by morning. Hayes nodded, then seemed to struggle with something. Finally, he spoke. About this morning, I was out of line. Yes, you were, Chen agreed simply. But right now, I'm more interested in the fact that you might have just helped us crack open a major lead. Want to come with me to review those camera feeds tomorrow? Hayes sat back, studying her face. You're really not what I expected. People rarely are, Officer Hayes. That's usually our own limitation, not theirs. Chen gathered her materials, leaving money on the table for their lunch. 7 a.m. tomorrow? I'll bring the warrant and the coffee. As they walked out of the diner, several patrons watched them curiously. The local gossip mill would be working overtime, the FBI agent and the cop who'd tried to humiliate her, working together like longtime partners. One more thing, Hayes said as they reached their cars. The owner of First Street Financial, he usually makes a big show of leaving at 5 every day. Except on Thursdays. On Thursdays, he comes back around 9. Chen paused, hand on her car door. Good detail. Anything else I should know? Probably lots, Hayes admitted. I'm starting to realize I might have spent too much time making assumptions and not enough time actually seeing what's in front of me. That's a good place to start, Chen replied. See you at 7. As she drove back to her hotel, Chen allowed herself a small smile. The day had gone exactly as she hoped, not because she'd put Hayes in his place, but because she'd begun the process of transforming an obstacle into an asset. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, she'd laid the groundwork for something more important than just solving a case. She'd started changing minds, one small-town police officer at a time. The security camera footage flickered on the small monitor in the back room of Cherry Grove Police Department. Agent Chen and Officer Hayes had been reviewing tapes for 3 hours straight, coffee cups piling up beside them. The early morning light had slowly brightened outside the window, but they barely noticed, absorbed in their work. There, Hayes pointed at the screen. Watch the guy in the gray suit. He shows up every Thursday at 9:15, like clockwork. He leaned closer to the monitor, squinting. Always carries the same brown briefcase. Chen nodded, making notes. Good catch. And look at his pattern. He never goes straight to Pete's bar. Always circles the block first. Counter-surveillance, Hayes muttered. Amateur hour, but still. The door opened, and Chief Thompson stuck his head in. You two been here all night? Since 5, Chen replied, not taking her eyes off the screen. Officer Hayes noticed something in the Thursday night patterns. We're building a timeline. The chief looked surprised, glancing between them. Just days ago, Hayes had been doing everything possible to undermine the FBI agent. Now they were working together like old partners. Got something? Hayes suddenly exclaimed. Look at this timestamp, 10:45 p.m. The First Street Financial owner doesn't just come back on Thursdays, he's meeting with our briefcase guy. Chen rolled the footage back, watching the interaction again. They're careful. Meeting looks casual, like they just happened to run into each other. But watch their hands. Something's being passed. Hayes finished her thought. Chief, we're going to need surveillance on that corner this Thursday. Thompson nodded slowly, still somewhat stunned by their seamless cooperation. I'll make it happen. Agent Chen, can I speak with you for a moment? In the hallway, Thompson lowered his voice. I have to admit, I was worried when you requested Hayes as your liaison, given his initial attitude. Chen smiled slightly. Sometimes the hardest critics become the strongest allies, Chief. Hayes is a good cop who just needed to set aside some preconceptions. Back in the review room, Hayes had pulled up another angle. Check this out, he called as Chen returned. The briefcase guy, he shows up at 3 other businesses on our suspect list. Always during off hours, always with that same briefcase. They spent the next few hours mapping out patterns, connecting dots that had been invisible when viewed separately. Hayes' knowledge of local business owners and their routines proved invaluable. The dry cleaner on 5th, he explained, spreading out a map. Owner complained last month about new competition cutting into his business. But I've never seen more than 2 customers in the new place, and they're still operating. Perfect front for money laundering, Chen nodded. Any connection to our Thursday night meetings? Hayes pulled out his notebook, flipping through pages of detailed observations. The new dry cleaner's owner is a regular at those poker games. And look at this, he pointed to a note. 3 weeks ago, I saw him talking to briefcase guy outside First Street Financial. You document everything like this? Chen asked, impressed by the level of detail. Hayes shrugged, looking slightly embarrassed. Been doing it for years, never knew what might be important. Most people used to joke about it, called me paranoid. That attention to detail is exactly what breaks cases wide open, Chen replied. We need to set up surveillance on all these locations. Think your guys can handle it without being noticed? Small town, Hayes grinned. Everybody knows everybody. Makes it harder to hide things, but easier to watch without being spotted. I know just the officers for the job. They spent lunch drawing up surveillance plans, picking officers who knew the local rhythms and wouldn't stand out. Hayes suggested positioning Officer Rodriguez at the coffee shop across from First Street Financial. He already stopped there every morning on patrol. Speaking of standing out, Hayes said hesitantly, I've been thinking about what you said about assumptions. About how I acted when you first arrived. Ken held up a hand. We've got a case to crack, Officer Hayes. Let's focus on that. He nodded gratefully, then turned back to the surveillance plans. The poker game starts at 9 tomorrow night. If we time this right, we can catch them in the act, Chen finished. But we need more than just surveillance. We need to get inside. Hayes sat back, thinking. You know, I played poker with Pete back in high school. Haven't been to his bar in years, but he might remember me. Think you can get into that game? Maybe. Hayes studied the map again. But if they're as careful as they seem, they'll be suspicious of a cop showing up suddenly. Chen smiled. Unless you show up tonight just for a beer. Start laying the groundwork. Make it look natural. Could work, Hayes nodded slowly. I'll mention something about being tired of watching TV alone every night. Pete always did like to talk. As they refined the plan, other officers began stopping by, drawn by the energy in the room. Each time, they found Chen and Hayes deep in discussion, surrounded by maps, photos, and notebooks. The change in Hayes was obvious. The hostile edge was gone, replaced by focused determination. Late afternoon sun was streaming through the windows when Chen finally called a break. Get some rest, she told Hayes. You've got a bar to visit tonight. Hayes gathered his notes, then paused at the door. You know what's funny? All these years, I thought being a good cop was about following my instincts. Turns out, sometimes your instincts need a wake-up call. Chen watched him leave, then turned back to the surveillance footage. The case was coming together, but something else was happening too. With every hour they worked together, another brick in the wall of prejudice crumbled. Tomorrow night would test both the case and their new partnership. But for now, she was satisfied. In just a few days, she'd turned her biggest obstacle into her strongest ally. And she'd done it not by forcing change, but by proving that competence and character mattered more than any preconceptions. She picked up her phone to call the FBI office in Cincinnati. They'd need backup for tomorrow night's operation. As she dialed, she couldn't help but smile, remembering Hayes' face when they'd spotted the pattern in the surveillance footage. Sometimes, the best victories weren't just about solving cases, they were about changing minds. Thursday night arrived with a light drizzle, casting a hazy glow around the streetlights near Pete's bar. Officer Hayes sat at the bar, nursing his second beer of the evening, while carefully watching the poker room's entrance through the mirror behind the liquor bottles. He'd spent the previous night reconnecting with Pete, sharing old high school stories and complaining about lonely evenings. You should join the Thursday game, Pete had suggested, just as Hayes had hoped. Like old times. Now, 24 hours later, Hayes was exactly where they needed him to be. Agent Chen's voice came through his concealed earpiece, barely a whisper. Target approaching from the south. Gray suit, brown briefcase. Hayes took another sip of his beer, keeping his movements casual. In the mirror, he watched the man with the briefcase enter, perform his usual circuit of the room, then settle at a corner table, right on schedule. "Got eyes on our guy," Hayes murmured into his beer glass, the sensitive microphone picking up his words. "Pete's heading over to him now." Outside, Chen sat in an unmarked car, coordinating with teams positioned around the block. Officer Rodriguez was in the coffee shop across the street, while other officers maintained discreet surveillance from various positions. The FBI backup team from Cincinnati was standing by, just out of sight. First Street financial owner just left his office. Rodriguez's voice came through the radio. "He's heading your way." Ken watched through binoculars as the bank owner walked down the street, making a show of checking his phone, just like they'd seen him do on the surveillance tapes. "Hayes, get ready. They're about to start the show." Inside, Hayes felt a tap on his shoulder. Pete stood there with a friendly smile. "Game's about to start. You in?" "Sure," Hayes replied, sliding off his bar stool. "Been a while, though. Go easy on me." The poker room was dimly lit, with 3 tables already full of players. Hayes recognized several faces from their investigation: the dry cleaner owner, a real estate agent they'd flagged, and a few out-of-towners who'd shown up in their surveillance photos. "Well, look who it is," the dry cleaner called out as Hayes approached. "Our local finest taking a night off." Hayes forced a laugh. Even cops need to relax sometimes. Besides, the FBI's in town now. Let them do all the work. A few chuckles around the table, though Hayes noticed the briefcase man's shoulders tense slightly at the mention of the FBI. Good, let them think he was just another cop blowing off steam, resentful of federal interference. The game progressed smoothly for the first hour. Hayes lost a few hands, won a few, all while watching the subtle interactions around him. The banker arrived right on schedule, taking a seat at the far table. Money flowed across the tables, more than should be normal for a small-town poker game. Movement at the back entrance. Chen's voice came through his earpiece. 2 new players coming in. Hayes glanced up as 2 men entered, both carrying similar briefcases to their original target. The pieces were falling into place. "All pieces on the board," Chen murmured in his ear. "Get ready." Hayes watched as the briefcases were casually placed near their owner's feet, occasional swift movements suggesting exchanges happening under the tables. His heart was pounding, but his face remained relaxed, focused on his cards. Then everything happened at once. The banker stood up, briefcase in hand, making his way toward the back room. At the same moment, the dry cleaner pushed back from the table, his own case ready. It was the moment they'd been waiting for, all the players in one place, the evidence literally in their hands. "FBI. Everyone stay where you are." Chen's voice rang out as she burst through the front entrance, backed by her team. Simultaneously, other agents and officers emerged from the back, covering all exits. The room erupted in chaos. Cards flew, chips scattered, and several players made desperate moves for the doors, only to find them blocked. Hayes stood up calmly, drawing his badge from his pocket. "Police? Hands where we can see them." The look of betrayal on Pete's face was almost comical. The briefcase man made a break for it, only to run straight into Officer Rodriguez coming through the side door. "You?" The dry cleaner spat at Hayes. "You've been playing us?" "No," Hayes replied, securing the man's hands behind his back. "I've been doing my job. Maybe for the first time in a while, doing it right." Chen moved through the room with practiced efficiency, directing the evidence collection. When she passed Hayes, she gave him a brief nod. "Nice work, officer." The next hour was a blur of activity. The FBI team discovered over $500,000 in cash in the briefcases, along with documents outlining the entire money laundering operation. Local news vans began arriving, drawn by the commotion and multiple police vehicles. As the last suspect was led out, Chief Thompson arrived on the scene. He surveyed the room, then turned to Chen and Hayes. "Impressive operation. Both of you." "Officer Hayes, I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it myself." Hayes looked at Chen, then back at his chief. "Had a good teacher this week, sir. Learned to see things differently." Later, as they stood in the drizzle watching the evidence vans being loaded, Chen turned to Hayes. You know, when this started, I don't think either of us expected to end up here. Hayes was quiet for a moment, watching the last of the suspects being driven away. I've been a cop for 15 years, he finally said. Thought I knew everything about this town, about this job. About other things too. He met her eyes. I was wrong about a lot of things. We all are sometimes, Chen replied. The trick is being willing to learn from it. The FBI team that came in for backup, Hayes said hesitantly, half of them were women. 3 were people of color. And every single one of them moved like professionals who knew exactly what they were doing. Just like every other professional who knows their job, Chen agreed. Funny how that works. Hayes nodded slowly. I've got a lot of thinking to do. About the way I've been doing things. The way I've been seeing things. In the distance, lightning flickered, promising more rain to come. But for now, they stood in the gentle drizzle, 2 law enforcement officers who'd started as adversaries and ended as partners, watching the results of their work unfold before them. You know what the hardest part was? Hayes asked suddenly. What's that? Realizing that everything I thought made me a good cop, my suspicions, my assumptions, was actually making me a worse one. You showed me what real police work looks like. Chen smiled. You showed yourself. I just gave you a reason to look. The morning after the raid, the Cherry Grove Police Department was buzzing with activity. News vans still camped outside, hoping to catch more details about the money laundering bust. Inside, Officer Hayes sat at his desk, staring at the morning paper. The headline read, FBI and local police cooperation leads to major financial crime bust. A coffee cup appeared on his desk. Agent Chen pulled up a chair, her own cup steaming in her hands. Quite a night, wasn't it? Hayes picked up the paper. You know what's funny? They got all the details about the crime right, but they missed the bigger story. Which is? How an FBI agent managed to turn around a stubborn small-town cop in less than a week. He set the paper down, meeting her eyes. That's the real story here. Chen took a sip of her coffee. Want to tell me about it? Hayes leaned back in his chair, gathering his thoughts. The usual morning bustle of the station continued around them. Phones ringing, officers checking in for their shifts, the constant hum of activity. I've been thinking about that first morning, he began. When you showed up and he traveled off, shaking his head. Made me show my ID 5 times. Chen offered with a slight smile. Yeah, that. Hayes stayed into his coffee. You know, my father was a cop here for 30 years. He had certain ideas about how things should be. Who should be doing what jobs? I grew up with those ideas, never questioned them. Through the office windows, they could see other officers gathering, some glancing their way. The story of Hayes's transformation had already spread through the department. But last night, Hayes continued, watching you coordinate that operation, the way you brought together local cops, FBI agents, everyone working like a single unit. It wasn't just professional, it was leadership, Chen suggested. Excellence, Hayes corrected. Pure excellence. And it made me realize how much time I've wasted judging people before seeing what they can do. A young officer approached their desk, case files in hand. Hayes recognized him as one of the rookies he previously brushed off during training sessions. Officer Hayes? The rookie said hesitantly. That thing you did last night, going undercover in the poker game, could you maybe teach some of us those observation techniques you used? Hayes glanced at Chen, who nodded encouragingly. Sure, he said, but first, let me introduce you to Agent Chen. She's the one who really taught me how to see what's important. As they discussed the operation with the rookie, more officers gathered around. Hayes found himself explaining not just the tactical details, but the deeper lessons he'd learned. It's about putting aside what you think you know, he told them. Looking at the evidence, the people, the situation, not your preconceptions about them. Sounds like that applies to more than just police work, someone commented. Hayes nodded. Yeah, it does. I had to learn that the hard way. Later, in the break room, Chen found Hayes staring at the department photos on the wall. Decades of Cherry Grove police officers, all looking remarkably similar. Thinking about changes? She asked. Chief Thompson asked me to head up a new community outreach program, Hayes replied. Wants to diversify our recruitment, build better relationships with all parts of town. And I said yes. He turned to face her. But I've got a favor to ask first. Chen raised an eyebrow questioningly. Would you come talk to our department? Share your experiences, not just about the case, but about, he gestured vaguely, everything else. The things I should have seen sooner. You think they're ready to hear it? Hayes looked around the station. After last night, yeah, they saw what real partnership looks like. What happens when we put aside our nonsense and work together? They're ready. Ken considered for a moment. On one condition. What's that? You speak first. Tell them your story. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from watching someone else confront their own biases. Hayes nodded slowly. Yeah, I can do that. Though it won't be easy. Growth rarely is, Chen replied. But you've already done the hardest part. They walked back to their desks, where more case files awaited. The paperwork from last night's raid would take days to process, but neither minded. Each form, each report represented another piece of justice served, not just for the crime they'd stopped, but for the bigger changes they'd started. You know what the worst part is? Hayes said suddenly. What's that? Realizing how many good officers I might have driven away over the years, how many potentially great partnerships I ruined before they could start. Chen set down her pen. The past is done. What matters is what you do now. That's why I want to head up this recruitment program, Hayes said. Do it right this time. Actually look for talent, not what I used to look for. A call came in. Another department requesting Hayes's insights on a possible financial crimes case. As he took down the details, Chen watched him work. His note-taking was still meticulous, but there was something different in his demeanor now. A new openness, a willingness to look beyond the surface. They want us both to consult, Hayes said after hanging up. Said they heard about how we worked together on this case. Us both? Chen smiled. Ready to partner with the FBI again. Ready to partner with someone who made me a better cop, Hayes corrected, and a better person. Outside, the news vans were finally packing up, the excitement of the bust fading into yesterday's news. But inside the Cherry Grove Police Department, something more important was taking root. Change, real change, was beginning, one officer, one conversation, one realization at a time. And it had started with a simple choice. The choice to look past assumptions and see the truth that had been there all along. 6 months had passed since the money laundering bust that shook Cherry Grove. The police department's main conference room was packed, every seat taken, with officers even standing along the walls. Agent Chen stood at the back, watching Officer Hayes address the assembled group of recruits and veterans alike. When Agent Chen first walked into this station, Hayes began, his voice carrying across the room. I was the biggest obstacle she faced. Not the criminals we were chasing, not the complex money trail we had to unravel. Me, a veteran officer who thought he knew everything there was to know about police work. The room was silent, everyone focused on Hayes. Among the faces, Chen noticed several new officers, diverse additions to the force that had joined through Hayes's recruitment program. I'm not proud of how I acted that day, Hayes continued. But I'm sharing this story because it's important. Because sometimes our biggest breakthroughs come from admitting our biggest mistakes. He clicked to the next slide, showing photos from the night of the raid. This case wasn't just about catching criminals. It was about learning to see beyond our assumptions. About understanding that excellence in law enforcement doesn't look like what some of us thought it looked like. A young female recruit raised her hand. Sir, what changed your mind? Hayes glanced at Chen, then back to the recruit. Competence, professionalism. Watching someone I dismissed prove me wrong in every possible way. But more than that, watching her do it without ever lowering herself to the level of my prejudice. He walked to the center of the room. In the 6 months since that case, our department has changed. We've recruited officers from all backgrounds. Our solve rate is up. Community trust has improved. And it all started because one FBI agent refused to let my attitude stop her from doing her job. Chen watched as Hayes shared specific examples from their investigation, teaching moments that went beyond just police work. He talked about the importance of detailed observation, but also about the danger of letting preconceptions color what you observe. The best evidence can be right in front of us, he explained, but if we're too busy judging the messenger, we'll miss the message completely. After the presentation, Officers lingered, forming small discussion groups. Chen overheard fragments of conversation. Officers sharing their own experiences, discussing changes they'd seen, asking questions about how to do better. "Quite a change from 6 months ago," she said as Hayes approached. "Remember that favor you did for us last month?" he asked. "The training session you led?" Chen nodded. She'd returned to Cherry Grove to conduct a workshop on financial crimes investigation. 3 other departments have requested the same training, Hayes continued. But they specifically asked for both of us to present, said they heard about how we work together. "Both of us?" Hayes smiled. "Turns out, the story of how an FBI agent and a small-town cop learned to work together has spread. People want to hear it. More importantly, they want to learn from it." Through the window, they could see new recruits practicing traffic stops in the parking lot. The scene looked different from 6 months ago. More women, people of color, a true reflection of the community they served. "You know what the best part is?" Hayes said, watching the training session. "Every one of those recruits is being evaluated on their skills, their character, their dedication, nothing else." A call came in. Another potential financial crimes case. Hayes took down the details, his notebook as meticulous as ever. But now, other officers gathered around, eager to learn from his experience. "Want to help us with this one?" he asked Chen after hanging up. "Could use your expertise." "Officially, I'm needed back in DC," she replied. "But I might know some qualified agents who could assist. Unless you still have issues working with federal agents." Hayes laughed. "I think I've learned my lesson. Though I did have one condition for the next agent they send." "What's that?" "That they be as patient with this old, reformed cop as you were." Later, as Chen prepared to leave the station, she paused at the entrance. The wall that once held only old photos of former officers now displayed a new collection. Photos of the current force, men and women of all backgrounds, working together, serving their community. Hayes joined her, looking at the photos. "You know, when you first walked in that door, I thought I was protecting something. Protecting the way things had always been. And now? Now I understand that real protection, real police work, isn't about keeping things the same. It's about making things better. For everyone." Outside, a new batch of recruits was arriving for their first day of training. Hayes straightened his uniform, ready to greet them. "Time to show them what real change looks like," he said. "You already have," Chen replied, "every day for the past 6 months." As she walked to her car, Chen heard Hayes beginning his welcome speech to the recruits. His voice carried across the parking lot, clear and confident. "Welcome to the new Cherry Grove Police Department. We've got a lot to teach you, but even more to learn together. Our strength isn't in being the same, it's in bringing different perspectives, experiences, and talents together to serve our community better." Chen smiled as she drove away. The case that had brought her to Cherry Grove was long solved, but its real impact was still unfolding. One department, one officer, one change at a time. Sometimes, the biggest victories weren't marked by headlines or arrests. Sometimes, they were measured in changed minds, opened hearts, and the slow but steady progress of justice becoming truly just.